The dust tasted of grit and endings. It had been her only food for 2 days, a fine red powder that coated her tongue and settled in the back of her throat. On the third day, she found the horse, its reins tangled in a skeletal cola. Its great patient head bowed against the unrelenting sun. This was Redemption, Colorado, the year of our Lord, 1878, and Alara, who was 21 and had already lived several lifetimes, was supposed to be dead. The stagecoach driver, a man with whiskey on his breath and fear in his eyes, had made sure of it, leaving her with a single canteen and a curse miles from any track after he'd read the letter that explained her past. He had not counted on the past being the very thing that would keep her alive. She untangled the reins, her fingers deft and sure, and the horse, the driver's own sturdy gelding, nuzzled her hand, smelling the salt of her skin, recognizing not a threat, but a survivor. She did not look back at the vast, indifferent expanse of the high desert. She looked forward toward the faint smudge of civilization against the mountains, and began to walk, leading the horse into a life she had paid for but did not yet own. The town of Redemption did not look up when she arrived. It was a place of straight lines and sharp angles, some skis. A main street carved from the dust, flanked by false-fronted buildings that squinted in the afternoon glare. Men paused, hands on hips, watching her progress. Women peered from behind lace curtains, their faces pale and indistinct. Alara walked down the center of the street, the gelding's steady hoof falls a counterpoint to the soft scuff of her own worn boots. She was a specter in their midst, a woman who should have been a sun-bleached memory, now leading the evidence of her abandonment. Her dress, a practical gray wool ordered from a catalog, was torn and stained. Her face smudged with dirt and streaked with sweat, but her back was straight. Her gaze was not defiant, nor was it meek. It was simply there, seeing everything, giving away nothing. She stopped in front of the largest building, the Mercantile, its porch sagging under the weight of barrels and the judgment of 2 men whittling. She tied the horse's reins to the hitching post, her knot the kind that holds but can be released with a single pull, a skill learned in a different life. Then she turned and faced the men. "I am looking for Silas Cole," she said. Her voice was low and raspy from thirst, but it carried in the sudden stillness. One of the men, the older one, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Silas Cole ain't looking for you, I reckon. Not you." The implication hung in the air, thick and foul. Alara did not flinch. She had been looked at with suspicion and fear for years. First by the people who had taken her, and then by the people who had rescued her. It was a familiar language. "Nevertheless," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength, "he is expecting a bride." The word bride seemed to suck the air from the street. It was a holy word, a word of promise and propriety, and it did not fit the wild, dusty creature standing before them. From inside the Mercantile, a man emerged, wiping his hands on a white apron. He was the proprietor, a man named Henderson, round and soft where the world outside was sharp and hard. He saw the horse first, his eyes widening. "That's Frank's horse," he said, his voice a squeak. "The stage driver." Alara met his gaze. "He left me," she said. It was not an accusation, just a statement of fact, as plain as the sky, as hard as the ground, and then a shadow fell across the porch, long and solid. A man had come from around the side of the building, drawn by the silence. He was tall, his shoulders broad enough to block the sun, his face a landscape of its own, weathered by wind and grief. A jagged scar, old and white, cut from his jaw to his temple. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, had seen too much and said too little. He held a hat in his calloused hands, twisting the brim. This was Silas Cole. He was 35, and the letter in his pocket described a docile, respectable girl from a good family back east. A girl who would help him raise a home from the raw timber of his loss. He looked at Alara, at the dirt on her face, the wildness in her stillness, the driver's horse tied to the post, and he knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut that this was not that girl. He had been sent something else entirely. He looked from her to the horse, then back to her. The whole town was watching, holding its breath. He was a man who valued his privacy, who had built his life around a core of stunts and hard work. And here was a spectacle unfolding on his doorstep. His first instinct was to deny it, to send her away, to retreat back into the quiet solitude of his ranch. But then he saw the way she stood, not defeated, not pleading, but rooted to the earth as if she had grown there. He saw the faint tremor in her hands, the only sign of the ordeal she had survived. And he saw something in her eyes, a deep banked fire that he recognized. For it was the same fire that smoldered in him. It was the look of someone who had lost everything and kept walking. He cleared his throat, a rough, grating sound. "I'm Silas Cole," he said, his voice as spare as the landscape. He did not offer his hand. He simply acknowledged the truth of her claim. He took a step forward, his worn boots making a soft thud on the wooden planks of the porch. He looked at Henderson. "Put her things on my account, whatever she needs." Then he turned back to Alara. "The ranch is a half-day's ride. We should start before we lose the light." He did not ask her what happened. He did not ask if she was hurt. He accepted her arrival as one accepts a sudden storm or an early frost, a fact of nature to be dealt with, not questioned. For Alara, who had braced herself for rejection, for more scorn, this simple, practical acceptance was more disarming than any kindness. She gave a single sharp nod. She had walked out of the desert. She could walk into this. The ride to the ranch was conducted in a silence broken only by the plodding of the horses and the sigh of the wind through the pines. Silas rode ahead, his back a rigid wall, leading the way up a winding track that climbed out of the dusty valley and into the high country. Alara followed on the gelding, her catalog dress a strange and formal garment in this wild place. She watched the way he sat his horse, a natural extension of the animal, his body moving with its rhythm. She watched the landscape change, the sagebrush giving way to aspen and pine, the air growing cooler, cleaner. This was a world she understood, the language of the trees, the scent of rain on the air, the way the light shifted as the sun dipped toward the mountains. This was more familiar to her than the crowded, noisy streets of the eastern city she had been forced to inhabit for the past 3 years. She had been reclaimed at 18, taken from the Inde tribe who had raised her since she was a child, the sole survivor of a raid on her family's wagon. The missionaries had called it a rescue. They had scrubbed her skin, put her in corsets, and taught her to speak English without an accent, to forget the tongue that held the stories of the They had tried to erase the girl who could track a deer for a day and find water where there was none, and replace her with a pale, respectable woman fit for society. They had failed. They had only succeeded in making her a stranger in both worlds. This marriage, arranged by a well-meaning but naive agency, was supposed to be her salvation, her final step into the civilized world. A homesteader in Colorado, a man of God, they had said, a new life. The ranch house came into view as the sun bled gold and crimson across the sky. It was not a cabin, but a house built of solid timber with a stone fireplace at its heart, and a wide porch that wrapped around it like a protective arm. It was a house built for a family, for a future. Now it stood silent, smoke curling from its chimney, a solitary outpost against the vast wilderness. It looked lonely. As they dismounted in the yard, a woman came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. She was older, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face lined with worry. This was Martha, the housekeeper, who had been with Silas since before his first wife, Sarah, had passed. She took one look at Alara, at her torn dress and dirt-streaked face, and her mouth formed a thin, disapproving line. "Silas," she said, her voice sharp. "What is this?" Silas swung down from his horse, his movements economical and weary. "This is Alara," he said, his voice flat. "My wife." The word hung in the air between them, a lie and a truth all at once. They were not married. The contract was for a marriage, but the circuit judge wouldn't be through for another month. For now, she was just here. Martha's gaze raked over Alara again, taking in the unkempt hair, the strange, still watchfulness in her eyes. "She's not what I expected." Silas's jaw tightened. "She's what we have," he said, the words a final, unarguable statement. He turned to Alara, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Martha will show you to your room. Supper is at 7. He did not wait for a reply, simply took the reins of both horses and led them toward the barn, his shoulders slumped with a weight that had nothing to do with the long day. Alara stood on the porch, the smell of wood smoke and pine filling her senses. She was an intruder here, a disruption to the quiet, ordered grief of this house. Martha held the door open, her posture stiff. "Come in, then. No sense letting the heat out." The inside of the house was clean and spare, dominated by the great stone fireplace. The furniture was handmade, sturdy and masculine. But there were touches of a woman's hand. A faded quilt draped over a chair, a row of empty canning jars on the mantel. A small framed photograph turned to face the wall. The ghost of the first wife, Sarah, was everywhere. "Your room is upstairs," Martha said, leading the way. It's the guest room." The room was small and clean, with a single window that looked out over the valley. A simple iron bedstead was covered with a thick, handmade quilt. A basin and pitcher sat on a small wooden stand. It was more luxury than Alara had known in years, yet it felt like a cage. Martha stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. "There's hot water in the pitcher. You'll find a dress in the wardrobe. It was Sarah's. It should do until we can get you to town for your own things." The offering of the dead wife's dress was not a kindness. It was a test, a statement of ownership, a reminder of who had come before and who could never be replaced. Alara met the older woman's gaze. "Thank you, Martha," she said, her voice even. "That is very thoughtful." She did not rise to the bait. She simply accepted. Martha seemed momentarily thrown off balance by the lack of reaction, then gave a curt nod and left, pulling the door almost closed behind her, but not quite, leaving it ajar. An observation post. Alone, Alara walked to the window. The last light of the sun was catching the tops of the mountains, turning them a deep, bruised purple. Below, in the corral, she could see Silas moving with a quiet efficiency, his routine so ingrained it was like breathing. He was a man locked in a pattern of work and memory. She turned from the window and looked at the dress hanging in the wardrobe. It was a simple calico, faded from washing, a ghost of a garment. She ran her fingers over the fabric. She could feel the presence of the other woman in its worn seams, in the faint scent of lavender that still clung to it. To wear it would be to step into another woman's life, a life that was not hers. She stripped off her own torn, filthy dress and washed her face and hands in the basin. The cold water a welcome shock. The dirt came away in muddy streaks, revealing the pale skin beneath. She looked at her reflection in the small, wavy mirror. The face that looked back was a stranger's, a pale imitation of the girl she had been. She left Sarah's dress hanging in the wardrobe. Instead, she took the spare shirt and trousers she had in her small bundle, a man's clothes, practical for travel, and put them on. They were clean, at least. When she went downstairs for supper, her hair still damp and combed back from her face, she was met with 2 pairs of startled eyes. Silas, who had just come in from the barn, stopped dead in the doorway. Martha, who was setting the table, dropped a fork with a clatter. The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Silas's eyes traveled from her hair, dark and slicked back, down the plain line of the men's shirt, to the trousers tucked into her boots. He had expected her to come down transformed, softened, perhaps wearing his dead wife's dress. He had not expected this. This was a statement, not of defiance, but of self-possession. It was as if she were saying, I am not her. I am not who you expected. I am this. Martha recovered first, her lips pursed so tightly they disappeared. Supper's on the table, she sniffed, turning her back on Alara to fuss with the pots on the stove. The meal was a tense affair. The stew was hearty, the bread was fresh, but the air was heavy with unspoken things. Silas ate with his head down, his focus entirely on his plate. Martha served, her movements sharp and judgmental. A young man, the ranch hand Jed, had joined them, his face open and curious, his eyes darting from Alara to Silas and back again. He was the only one who seemed unabashedly interested. Alara ate slowly, methodically. The food was a gift. The warmth of the fire was a gift. After days in the desert, these simple things were a miracle. She did not need conversation. She did not need acceptance. She needed to replenish her strength. After the meal, Silas pushed his chair back. Jed, you see to the horses. Martha, thank you for the supper. He was dismissing them, clearing the stage. When they were gone, he remained at the table, staring into the fire. Alara began to gather the plates. Leave them, he said, his voice quiet but firm. She stopped, her hands hovering over a plate. He finally looked at her, his gaze direct and searching. The driver, what happened to him? Alara set the plates down and sat back in her chair. She folded her hands in her lap, a gesture of stillness she had learned long ago. He read the letter from the agency, she began, her voice a low monotone. The one that explained my history. He said he wouldn't have a savage in his coach. He drove a few miles off the main track, pulled a gun on me, and told me to get out. He left me the canteen. He said it was more than I deserved. She relayed the facts without emotion, as a scout reports the lay of the land. Silas listened, his face a mask of stone, but a muscle jumped in his scarred jaw. He was a man who understood the harshness of the world, but this was a particular kind of cruelty, a small, mean act of cowardice. The horse? He asked. He was careless when he drove off. The horse broke its tether during the night. I found its tracks in the morning. I followed them. He was tangled in some cola, thirsty but unharmed. Silas stared at her, the story settling in the space between them. She hadn't overpowered the driver. She hadn't sought revenge. She had simply survived, and in surviving, she had triumphed. It was a quiet, profound victory that he, a man of few words and deep hurts, could understand far better than any dramatic tale. He nodded slowly. The horse and the saddle are yours, he said. Payment for the fare you were denied. It was a gesture of justice, a rebalancing of the scales. He stood up and walked to the mantel, his back to her. He picked up the small, framed photograph that was turned to the wall and held it in his hands, his thumb stroking the edge of the wood. This arrangement, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not hide. It was a mistake. I thought I needed a wife, a mother for... He trailed off, unable to say the words. He put the photograph back down, still facing the wall. My wife, Sarah, she died 2 years ago, in childbirth. The child, a boy, he died with her. The confession fell into the silent room, a weight of grief so palpable Alara felt she could touch it. This house was not just empty. It was haunted by a future that had never arrived. Now she understood the silence, the order, the photograph turned to the wall. It was a mausoleum of memory. I'm sorry, she said, the words inadequate but sincere. He shook his head, still not looking at her. I thought another woman, a good woman, could make this a home again. I thought it would be simple. I would provide a home, a name. She would provide life. He finally turned, and his eyes were raw with a pain that was 2 years old but as fresh as a new wound. This is not a home, miss. It's a grave, and I have no right to ask you to lie in it with me. He was giving her an out. He was telling her she was free to go, that the contract was meaningless in the face of this much sorrow. He expected her to take it. Any sensible woman would. But Alara was not any sensible woman. She had been bought and sold, rescued and abandoned, her life a series of transactions made by others. For the first time, a man was offering her a choice, born not of convenience but of a shared, if unspoken, understanding of loss. She stood up and walked to the fire, holding her hands out to the warmth. She was not afraid of ghosts. She had been living with her own for years. "You sent for a bride, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "The contract is paid. I am here. Where else would I go?" She was not staying for him. Not yet. She was staying for herself. This place, this broken man and his haunted house was the only claim she had in the world. It was a piece of solid ground, and she would not be moved from it easily. Silas watched her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Surprise, respect? He didn't know. He only knew that the silence in the house felt different now. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the seasons. It was a life of hard, repetitive work, and Alara threw herself into it with a silent, focused energy that both impressed and unsettled Martha. She rose before dawn, her footsteps soft on the wooden stairs. She learned to milk the cow, her hands, once soft from 3 years of forced idleness, quickly growing strong and capable. She learned the rhythms of the kitchen, not from Martha's grudging instructions, but from observation. She watched how Martha kneaded the bread, how she added just enough salt to the stew, how she banked the fire at night. Then, when Martha was not looking, she would practice, her movements precise and efficient. She was a quick study, too quick. It unnerved the older woman, this quiet, watchful presence who seemed to absorb skills through the air itself. Alara did not try to win her over. She simply worked, earning her place not with words but with her hands. Her relationship with Silas was one of respectful distance. They were two planets orbiting the same dying sun of his grief. They ate their meals together in near silence, the only sounds the scrape of cutlery and the crackle of the fire. But it was a silence that was beginning to change. It was less the silence of strangers and more the silence of two people who understood that some things did not need to be said. He would watch her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. He watched her mend a fence with Jed, her hands as nimble and sure as any man's. He watched her in the kitchen garden she had started, coaxing green shoots from the stubborn autumn soil. He had bought a wife to fill a void, expecting a creature of softness and domesticity. He had gotten a survivor, a woman as tough and resilient as the mountain landscape itself. He did not know what to do with her. The first trip to town was a necessary evil. Supplies were low, and the first snows were not far off. The prospect of it hung over the ranch for a day, a palpable tension. To take Alara to town was to publicly claim her, to present her to the judging eyes of redemption. To leave her behind would be an insult, an admission that he was ashamed of her. In the end, there was no choice. He hitched the wagon and she climbed up beside him, wearing not Sarah's dress but a new, simple one of dark blue cotton she had sewn herself from a bolt of fabric she'd found. It was practical, unadorned, and entirely her own. The town received them with a collective held breath. As Silas guided the wagon down the main street, curtains twitched, conversations paused. Alara sat straight-backed, her gaze fixed ahead, a small, still island in a sea of whispers. At the mercantile, Henderson was painfully polite, his eyes darting nervously towards Alara. The other customers gave them a wide berth, a circle of silence and suspicion. It was here that they encountered the town's other pole of power, a wealthy rancher named Elias Beaufort. Beaufort was a man who owned much of the valley and felt he was entitled to the rest. He was handsome in a florid, overfed way, his clothes expensive, his smile predatory. He had been trying to buy Silas's land for years, coveting the water rights that came with it. He approached them, his smile wide and insincere. "Cole," he said, his voice booming in the quiet store, "I see you've returned from your shopping." His eyes slid over Alara, a slow, insolent appraisal that was more insulting than any slur. "An interesting acquisition. Does she have a name?" Silas, who had been examining a list, went very still. The air grew thick. He turned slowly, and for a moment Alara saw a flash of the violence he kept so tightly leashed. His hand, resting on a sack of flour, clenched into a fist. But then he seemed to draw all that anger inward, banking it like a fire. He moved to stand beside Alara, not touching her, but his presence was a wall, a bulwark. He was a man standing beside her in town. "This is my wife," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Mrs. Cole." He said the name with a finality that echoed in the silent store. It was the first time he had called her that, the first time he had claimed her so publicly. Beaufort's smile faltered. He had expected Silas to be ashamed, to be cowed. This quiet, unshakable dignity was something his money couldn't touch. "My apologies, Mrs. Cole," he said, tipping his hat to Alara with mock courtesy. "Welcome to redemption. I trust you'll find it accommodating." The threat was clear. He turned his attention back to Silas. "Still holding on to that windswept pile of rocks, Cole? I made you a fair offer. It's still on the table. Winter's coming. A hard winter, they say. It would be a shame for your new bride to have to endure it." Silas met his gaze without flinching. "My wife and I find the accommodations on our ranch to be more than adequate. It's our home. It's not for sale." He picked up a sack of flour with one hand, as if it weighed nothing, and placed it in their cart. He then looked at Alara, a question in his eyes. She understood. She was his partner in this, not a bystander. She picked up a small bag of sugar and placed it in the cart next to the flour. "We'll need this," she said, her voice clear and steady. "For canning. The apples will be ready soon." It was a simple domestic statement, but in the context of the confrontation, it was a declaration of intent. It said, "We are building a life here. We are planning for a future." Beaufort's face darkened. He had been dismissed, not by the grieving widower, but by the strange, silent woman at his side. He gave a curt nod and strode out of the store, his humiliation radiating from him like heat. The other customers began to breathe again, busying themselves with their own shopping. But something had shifted. They had witnessed an act of quiet courage, a unified front. Silas and Alara finished their shopping in silence, but it was a new kind of silence, one of camaraderie. On the ride home, as the wagon wheels rumbled over the familiar track, he turned to her. "Thank you," he said. She just nodded, her eyes on the horizon, where the mountains stood solid and enduring. The incident in town, though small, was a turning point. A thaw began, slow and almost imperceptible, like the first melting of ice at the edge of a frozen river. Silas began to talk more, not about his grief, but about the land. He showed her the ridge that overlooked the entire valley, a hidden place of breathtaking beauty. He pointed out the different peaks, naming them like old friends. He showed her the stand of aspen where he and his father had cut the timber for the house. He was sharing his history, the part of him that was tied to this place, the part that existed before Sarah. One evening, As they sat by the fire, he finally took the photograph from the mantel and turned it around. It was a formal portrait of a young woman with a sweet, gentle face and hopeful eyes. Sarah. He placed it back on the mantel, facing out this time. It was no longer a secret shame, but a memory given its proper place. Elara watched him, her heart aching with a strange mix of emotions. She felt sorrow for this woman she would never know, and for the man who had loved her. And she felt something else, something new and unsettling, a flicker of jealousy, not for the woman herself, but for the easy, uncomplicated love she had clearly inspired. One afternoon in the barn loft, a space that smelled of hay and dust and time, she found a small, locked wooden chest. Jed, seeing her curiosity, told her it was Sarah's. Silas had put it up there after she died and had not touched it since. That night, after supper, after Martha had gone to bed, Elara found Silas staring into the fire, a familiar, haunted look on his face. She hesitated, then spoke. "There's a chest in the loft," she said quietly. "Jed said it was Sarah's." He stiffened, his back rigid. "It's just some of her things. Letters, a journal." "You should read them," she said. He turned to her, his face taut with old pain. "Why? To torture myself?" "No," she said, her gaze unwavering. "To let her go. You've kept her a ghost, Silas, a perfect silent memory. Maybe it's time to remember she was a person, a woman who had her own thoughts, her own fears." It was a bold thing to say, a trespass on sacred ground. He stared at her, his sky-blue eyes stormy. For a long moment she thought he would order her from the room. Instead, he gave a short, harsh laugh. "And what would you know of it?" The question was a challenge, a demand for her own story which she had guarded so carefully. She took a breath. "I know what it's like to be haunted," she said, and then for the first time she told him. She told him about the raid, the fire, the fear. She told him about being taken in by the Ninde, about the woman, she who remembers, who had taught her the names of the plants and the stories of the stus. She told him about the kindness she had found there, the sense of belonging. And then she told him about the rescue, about being torn away from the only family she had known for a decade, about the cold, sterile mission where they tried to wash the wildness out of her. She spoke in a low, even voice, but the pain was a current beneath the surface, a river of loss that ran as deep as his own. When she finished, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire. Silas was looking at her not as a strange, wild creature, but as a person, a woman who had endured her own unspeakable grief. He had thought his own sorrow was a unique and impassable mountain, but here was a woman who had crossed a desert of her own. He said nothing. He simply stood up, went to the hook by the door and took down a lantern. He lit it, the small flame pushing back the shadows, and walked out of the house toward the barn. Elara watched him go from the window. A few minutes later, a light appeared in the window of the barn loft. It burned there for a long time, a solitary star in the vast, dark night. He did not come back to the house until just before dawn. He looked exhausted, his face pale, but the haunted look in his eyes was gone. It had been replaced by a profound, weary sadness and something else. Peace. He walked over to the fireplace where she had fallen asleep in the chair. A blanket pulled around her. He gently took the blanket and draped it more securely around her shoulders. His fingers brushed her cheek, a touch as light as a moth's wing. It was the first time he had touched her with any kind of tenderness. He did not wake her. He just stood there for a moment, watching her sleep in the soft glow of the firelight. Then he went to his own room, and for the first time in 2 years, he slept without dreaming of ghosts. The first snow came a week later. A soft, silent blanket that transformed the rugged landscape into a place of stark, monochrome beauty. The world shrank, pulling in on itself. The ranch became an island in a sea of white. The enforced intimacy of winter could have been a prison. Instead, it became a crucible. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a shared space, comfortable and known. They worked together, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. They repaired harnesses in the barn, the smell of leather and oil mingling with the cold air. They sat by the fire in the long evenings, she mending, he carving small, intricate animals from scraps of wood. He was surprisingly skilled, his large, calloused hands capable of great delicacy. He gave her a small, perfectly carved bird, its wings outstretched as if in flight. She kept it on the mantel next to Sarah's photograph. Martha watched the slow, quiet blooming of their relationship with a grudging, silent approval. She even started leaving a pot of coffee on the stove for Ilara in the mornings, a small but significant truce. But the peace of their isolated world was not to last. One Sunday, as the snows began to melt and the world turned to mud, Silas announced they were going to church. It was not a request, it was a statement. The town had judged them, and now he was going to face that judgment head-on with her by his side. The church was a small white building with a tall steeple, a beacon of piety in the center of town. As they walked up the steps, a hush fell over the congregation gathered outside. It was one thing to see them in the mercantile, another to see them here in God's house. They were an affront to the town's sense of order. The whispers followed them down the aisle. The savage bride. Look at the way he looks at her. He's shaming his first wife's memory. Ilara kept her eyes forward, her back straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She could feel the weight of their stares like a physical blow. Silas led her to a pew near the front, his hand resting for a moment on the small of her back, a silent gesture of support. Elias Beaufort was there, of course, in the front pew, the picture of prosperity and righteousness. He watched them with a small, smug smile, as if he had orchestrated this humiliation. The sermon was about temptation and the fall from grace. The preacher, a stern man with a booming voice, seemed to direct his words right at them. Ilara felt a flush of shame and anger rise in her cheeks. She had survived starvation, abandonment, and loss. She would not be shamed by these small, frightened people. After the service, as they were filing out, Beaufort blocked their path. He had a document in his hand. "Cole," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've had my lawyer draw up a new offer for your land, a generous one, enough for you to take your wife and start over somewhere else, somewhere more welcoming." He was using their shame as a weapon, trying to drive them out. People gathered around, eager to see the final act of this drama. Silas looked at the paper in Beaufort's hand, then at the faces of the townspeople hungry for a scandal. He looked at Ilara, who stood beside him, her face pale but her chin held high. He saw not a savage, not a mail-order bride, but a queen. A quiet strength flowed from him, a decision made in the crucible of winter, in the quiet moments of shared work and understanding. He turned back to Beaufort. "My land is not for sale, Beaufort, but you're right. It's time to settle things." He took the paper from Beaufort's hand, but he didn't look at it. Instead, he walked to the small table at the front of the church where the preacher kept his records. He uncapped the inkwell and took the pen. The church was utterly silent. Everyone expected him to sign Beaufort's offer to admit defeat. Instead, he took out another document from his coat pocket. It was a deed, a blank deed of title. He began to write, his hand steady. When he was finished, he straightened up and faced the congregation. "I came here today to introduce my wife," he said, his voice ringing with a clarity and force no one had ever heard from him. "But I see now that introductions are not enough. Actions are what matter." He turned to Ilara. "Ilara," he said, and the way he said her name was a prayer. "When I brought you here, I offered you a home and my name. It was a bargain made of need and sorrow. But you have given me more than that. You have given me life. He held up the deed he had just filled out. This ranch, this land, it is all I have in the world. It was to be my son's legacy. It was my prison. Now, I want it to be your freedom. He held the deed out to her. In the space for the owner's name, he had written hers. Elara Cole. He was giving her everything. The land, the house, the water rights Beaufort so coveted. He was giving her the power. It's yours, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Free and clear, you can sell it to Beaufort, you can tell me to leave, you can burn it to the ground, or you can choose to stay, you can choose to build a life here with me. Not as part of a bargain, but as a choice. Your choice. A collective gasp went through the church. Beaufort's face was a mask of stunned fury. He had been publicly, utterly humiliated, his greed exposed and trumped by an act of stunning generosity and love. Elara looked at the deed in his hand, then at his face. She saw no calculation there, only a raw, terrifying vulnerability. He was giving her the power to destroy him and trusting that she wouldn't. All her life she had been a pawn, her fate decided by others. The Ende had chosen to keep her. The missionaries had chosen to rescue her. The agency had chosen to sell her. Silas had chosen to buy her. Now, for the first time, the choice was hers, and it was the easiest choice she had ever made. She did not take the deed. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand over his on the paper. Our home, she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the stunned sumts. Our choice. She looked from Silas to the shocked faces of the townspeople, her gaze lingering for a moment on the preacher. Judge not, she said softly, lest ye be judged. Then she turned, and with her hand still on his, she walked with her husband out of the church and into the bright, clean sunlight, leaving the whispers and the judgment behind them in the dark. They did not speak on the ride home. There were no words for what had passed between them. The world looked different, sharper, more vibrant. The green of the new spring leaves was almost painfully bright. When they reached the ranch, he helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist for a heartbeat longer than necessary. In the house, the air was still and expectant. Martha had left a fresh-baked pie on the table, her silent offering of peace and approval. He followed her up the stairs. He stopped at the door to his room. She continued to the guest room, her room. She opened the door and stepped inside. A moment later, she heard the soft thud of his boots being set down outside his door. It was a signal, a question asked without words. He was respecting her space, her choice, even now. She stood in her room, her heart pounding. The room was no longer a cage, but a haven. She looked at the simple bed, the handmade quilt. She thought of the long road that had brought her here, the dust, the fear, the loneliness. And she thought of the man in the next room, the quiet, broken man who had seen her. Not what they told him she was, but who she truly was. She walked to the door and opened it. His boots sat on the floorboards, solid and real. The door to his room was slightly ajar. A sliver of light fell into the hallway. She took a breath, a long, slow breath, and walked across the hall. She pushed the door open. He was standing by the window, looking out at the mountains, his back to her. He did not turn. "Elara," he said, his voice a rough whisper. She walked to him, her footsteps silent on the floor. She came to stand beside him, following his gaze to the peaks, now bathed in the soft, rosy light of dusk. She slipped her hand into his. His fingers, calloused and strong, closed around hers, holding on as if he were drowning. And in the quiet of the room, with the mountains as their witness, their two solitary worlds finally, irrevocably, became one. The camera holds on their clasped hands, then fades slowly to black. The epilogue opens on a golden evening, years later. The ranch house is the same, but fuller, more lived in. The porch has been extended and two small chairs sit beside two larger ones. A swing hangs from the branch of a mature oak tree that wasn't there before. The sound of children's laughter drifts on the wind. Elara, her hair now showing a few threads of silver at the temples, is on the porch mending a small pair of trousers. The front door opens and Silas emerges. He is older, the lines on his face deeper, but the haunted look is gone forever, replaced by a quiet contentment. He carries 2 cups of coffee and hands one to her, his hand brushing hers in a familiar, loving gesture. He sits beside her and they watch as 2 children, a boy of about 7 with his father's quiet intensity and a girl of 5 with her mother's watchful eyes, chase fireflies in the twilight. The lamp on the porch is lit, a warm, welcoming glow against the encroaching dark. Silas looks at his wife, at the peaceful, capable lines of her face, at the home they have built, the life they have chosen. He remembers the dusty, half-wild creature who walked out of the desert and into his broken life. "I thought I was saving you," he says, his voice a low rumble full of the years and the love between them. Elara looks up from her sewing, her eyes meeting his. A small, knowing smile touches her lips. She looks out at their children, at the land stretching out before them, their land. "Did you now?" she asks softly. Close on the small, perfectly carved bird on the mantelpiece, its wings forever outstretched, next to the faded photograph of Sarah, a respected memory in a house now full of life. Outro. I really hope you enjoyed that story. It was a journey to write, and I love exploring those themes of quiet strength and earned love. If you felt that connection too, if you found yourself rooting for Elara and Silas, please take a moment to click that like button. And if you want more stories like this, stories that take their time and try to find the heart of things, consider subscribing to the channel. It really does help, and it means we can keep building these worlds together. Thank you for listening.